there is a lot of valuable information that lives in your head. Making sure that that knowledge is transferred is super important. And if you start, within your company, let's say you have your own enterprise LLM, well, you want to have very crisp documentation about the things that you've implemented because that's what it's going to learn from. Because the real value with Gen AI eventually is really going to be getting it to understand how you work in your company, what your company's strategy is, and there's no way that it's gonna learn it if you don't write it and if you don't feed that into its
Right.
knowledge base. The easier you can make knowledge flow throughout the organization, the more aligned everyone is going to be.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to be speaking the same language. Everyone's going to be speaking the same terminology.
Hello from coast to coast and around the world to another episode of the Decision Intelligence Lab podcast. Along with my co-host Michael Watson, I'm thrilled today to welcome Dr. Carlos Zetina to the podcast. Carlos has a PhD in industrial engineering from Concordia University in Canada and has worked both in the consulting space and for a couple of years at Amazon, and most recently and most sharply in terms of today's episode, plays a really critical role as a pre-sales consultant and engineer at FICO. Carlos, welcome to the podcast, and over to you, Mike, to get us started.
Yeah. Welcome, Carlos. Why
Thank you.
don't so VJ kind of highlighted your career? Why don't you outline sort of how you ended up at FICO and pre-sales? Like what steps led you there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, if you take a 30,000 foot view, it seems somewhat disparate roles. Um, And I've always thought there's not a lot of logic to my madness in terms of my career, but there is an underlying kind of theme behind it. So I started off in risk consulting for banks right after the master's degree. And I remember the first project I did was a lot about efficiency, and it was more of a strategic management consulting type of project. And I honestly hated that. Um, but then the following project started to deal with technology. What we started to do was we had to find a way to streamline the reporting of the risk. These banks carried huge portfolios and had a lot of credit risk. And they had to automate the reporting for it. Back in that time, this was done like line by line with a ruler on a
Okay.
sheet of paper on accounts. And so we had to
Wait
convert
a
that.
minute, Carlos. Like you're not old enough to have like you to tell that story. I'm not going to let you get away with that. Like,
But that still happened in 2012. And so the issue that came about from that was that banks couldn't replicate that process because a lot of the kind of criteria with which they would put something in the report or not was something that was here in each person's head. And so what came about from that was a huge overhaul of technology, creating databases, automating data flow, and automating the calculator that gave these reports. So that was the second project I was on. And there is when I started to realize, technology really changes a lot. And at that point in time, regulation was very much on paper and wasn't immediately translated. So we had to translate regulation into kind of
yeah.
digital artifact that could be streamlined and moved. After that, I did my PhD. I went to do my PhD and then got deeper into tech. I started working in mixed integer programming, network design, and started actually coding and programming for the first time. And I just went deeper into it, fell in love with the topic. I had initially been introduced to it in my bachelor's, but there is when I started to really think of myself as a tech person
Yeah.
and doing research and trying to push the boundaries on what can we solve quickly. These were really clearly defined problems. We just knew we couldn't solve them with a just state of the art commercial solver. We need to do something smarter, and I had to figure out what that thing that was smarter was. Right. After that, I did a postdoc with Andrea Lodi and kept working on that, but I with somewhat more a broader perspective on how do we make general solvers more efficient. Andrea started a consulting company called Ivado Labs, and I was intrigued again. So now I started interfacing with, what types of problems were they trying to solve, and Andrea gave me an opportunity to join the company. And so then now I was starting to apply technology in a consulting, again, in a consulting area, but now with very deep and specialized knowledge. They essentially were trying to do technology transfer from research into, you know, businesses, actual businesses here in Canada and the US. So that kind of transition came smooth. But if you look at it like from 50 feet away, it's like, okay, you did risk consulting, a bit of management consulting, then you did research, and now you're doing consulting to build. We used to build actual software there and ship it.
Okay.
And then from there, um, just around 2022, you might recall there was a global pandemic and there was a huge demand for OR scientists and data scientists. And Amazon kept the knocking. So I finally interviewed for a position as a research scientist and joined there. And that was probably the 3 years of the fastest learning that I've ever had in my in my career.
Was
But
Amazon as intense as we hear about from the outside?
so Amazon has a lot of very smart, very motivated people. Because of that, you also, and this is where a lot of the stuff that I'll talk about comes, is that you have to really defend and understand the problem space that you're in and the problem you're trying to solve. Because everyone that you're meeting with and that you need to align with is trying to solve the general problem space. And
Yeah.
anything you build interacts or impacts the things that they're building. And so building alignment with an organization is a huge part of, Amazon's culture. And I think that's where the reputation about intensity comes, because you're in a room with a lot of smart people and you will be challenged. And that's a good thing, to be
Right.
honest,
Yes.
because it helps people filter out when we're trying to solve the wrong problem. It's a lot about truth seeking rather than pitching. And so the way it's set up, it's really eye opening in terms of understanding it's not just about the tech, but really a lot about how we apply it and how we scale it responsibly.
It's funny talking about Amazon. I'm currently reading the Working Backwards book. And so
Yeah,
that kind of organically leads me to kind of ask you about something that you've called the problem driven solution framework. Kind of, you want to tell our audience what's the core idea behind it and
yeah,
what kind of mistakes does that help organizations not make?
yeah. No, that's a great question. So the problem-driven solution is something that I somewhat came up with, and it's based heavily on my experience at Amazon. So it does have a lot of the working
Yeah.
backward flavor to it. But essentially, you can think about it this way. You're in an organization. That organization has a certain scope. That scope, so I'm going to give practical examples so that it becomes more
Yeah.
tangible. Um, so let's say the scope is sourcing, which is you need to decide what providers you're going to have, you're going to source from, when you're going to source from them, what cost structure you're going to establish with them to be able to import, and how that's going to affect ultimately your supply chain and your inventory. Once you've decided on that space, there is a process where you need to identify what are the different problems and decisions that are being made in this problem space and who is owning them. You need to get those people in a room and discuss what are the actual problems that this entire space is seeing. And so let's say, for example, there's someone who's in charge of negotiating with vendors. They might have a problem that is very different than the person who needs to decide, how do I pack all the articles I've purchased into a truck to send it in a manner that's efficient enough. And that's also very different than the people that are at the facilities that are receiving this type of all these shipments, and they need to decide how they're gonna, schedule them, when they should allow trucks to arrive, etc. But by looking at the entire problem space, understanding the problems that people are facing, quantifying them, and having that exercise of debating what should we solve, not how, what, that's really kind of the basis of, the problem driven solution. And so this is not new. This is something that Amazon does. This is something that one of your recent guests also speaks about, which is the meta problem, Zohar.
Right.
it's common knowledge, but it's great that there are people that are actually trying to, write it out and
Yeah.
author things that provide a framework for people to not have to go through it. So you don't have to go to Amazon to learn this way of doing it. There is a book that teaches you about this, and there's a framework that has formalized this, and that's kind of where this framework is, what this framework is based on.
So Carlos, in that framework, do you is part of the point of it to sort of figure out like what the what the real bottleneck is? And there's 100 problems, and you're trying to get to the truth of like, all right, which if we worked on which one problem, it's going to free up the most capacity or the most value for the business. Is that the point of this process?
Part of it, but there's also, it helps you understand dependencies. So you might create another bottleneck down the road by liberating one. And the idea behind these, so in Amazon, these meetings are called operational plans. They're kind of scheduled yearly, and these debates happen actively about that. So what problems should we look at? And then you get into a kind of like a way of hypothetically thinking, okay, what if we did this? What else could we impact? Where are we moving that bottleneck? And how can we address it in such a way that you're kind of planning for the year
Okay.
how things are going to roll out? And so it's a lot more than just planning a project. It's more kind of like planning a roadmap.
And this is a once a year exercise, kind of.
Yeah, right. So at Amazon, this was a once a year exercise. So I'm working on trying to implement this as well wherever I work. And I try to do it a bit more frequently, probably every half a year, just to revisit. Because things change, you, the world changes. I mean, if you look at gas right now, I mean, there's been a huge change there. Airline companies have even started to project, like, you know what, we're going to try to deal with, gas cost that is a lot higher than it is now. So those kinds of things happen, and you need to have kind of that mechanism, somewhat cadence, to make
Well, let,
sure that you're always up to date.
well, let me ask one more question about the cadence. I assume you do it once a year or twice a year because it sounds like there's to do it right, you need a lot of prep work. You can't just come into a meeting and start saying, what are our problems? And then 2 hours
Yeah.
later, get out. Can you give us a sense of like, what's the time? Like, how much prep work does everyone do? How long, the meeting's like a week long meeting? Like what's sort of
So
the prep
no,
and the time to do this?
that's a great call out. So problems are always there. And
Right.
Amazon has a really good writing culture. So in any given point, someone has identified a problem and there is some document written about the problem or about the solution or what they envision this being. So prep work is kind of somewhat front loaded just because that writing culture is there, those artifacts already exist. The meetings themselves are days long. So it's like at that time I was remote. So I'm in Montreal. I'm still in Montreal. But I'll be flown out to Seattle for a whole week for those types of meetings. And at the end of that, we had a document in which we had aligned on the priorities, what we're going to work on, and how we see all of this coming together and impacting the business.
Perfect. So the week long meeting gives you time to debate, gives you time to go out to dinner, mull on it overnight, come back and
Yeah,
debate more in the morning, start putting together. Perfect. Okay, good. I just wanted to get a sense of that because it's like sometimes you think like, oh, get together in a room, 1 hour later, you're ready to go, and it's like,
no,
no, these things are actually harder.
these are expensive meetings because these
Yeah,
involve people
right.
that are in high positions, but they're necessary. And as I mentioned, like I think Zohar mentioned this as well. There's sometimes the best solution is finding a better problem. And so this
Yeah.
is that
Ugh.
exercise where they find not just the better problem, they bring up a whole roadmap of what we're going to do next.
Perfect.
So let me jump off from there and say, okay, now that we've identified the portfolio problems, we've identified the highest value one or small set. Uh, Talk to us a bit about the decision framing process, and it'd be great if you've got an example or two to make that concrete.
Yeah, no, for sure. Let me even give you a live example, an experience example. Um, so when I first started, working in consulting and so on, we had gotten to the point where we had discussed with the client. They knew what they wanted. I wasn't part of that process, but essentially, I was handed out the scope of listen, they need to know which products are going to be imported. I'm like, okay, give me
Okay.
the data. And I had just framed this up very simply and said, okay, if this is what they want, the idea is if I can get the data on which items perform well historically when they're imported, because the lead times match up, etc. I can build a machine learning model that predicts which ones will perform well. Huge failure. Huge failure. And the reason for that is I never consulted the people that were actually making those decisions. And so the decision framing itself also, and a key to it is also understanding how this process is being done from the people that are actually doing that process. And so having, lived that experience and now being more senior, how would I have done it? Well, the idea is getting in touch with the people that are there, understanding what their decision process is, what it is that they're trying to maximize or minimize, what are they trying to optimize for, and also understanding their beliefs. So this is something that it's hard to do. There is a delicate balance between asking someone what their beliefs are and it not being somewhat offensive, because
Yes.
a lot of assumptions also you have to question a lot of assumptions as well. Like you have to go in with an open mind to understand why certain things are done, but you also have to go in with a critical mind of, okay, does this actually hold? Does this really hold? And do I have data that shows that it doesn't hold? And so that part of the process is really important. And Warren Powell, in his what he calls his little book, his sequential decision analytics book, chapter 1 of that little book has a really great description of how to go about this, how to understand, what are the variables, what are the conditions, what are the actions, and what are the beliefs. And so that if anyone is starting to look into this space, I highly recommend going deep into that book when you're thinking about, decision framing or the analytics framing of understanding, like, what are the things that I have to put together in my decision or analytics artifact.
Perfect. Let's can we change gears and let's continue with your career path. Like after you left Amazon, you've now joined FICO and you joined in the pre-sales side. So I'm a huge fan of pre-sales. So why don't you tell us, like, what is pre-sales, so people who don't know, and also, like, why did you make this move, and
Yeah,
what's it entail?
no, that's a great question. So pre-sales, others might know it as sales engineering. They're more or less the same.
Yep.
The functions that people do are essentially the same. I honestly like the term solutions engineering a little more than pre-sales, but I mean, it's just the word at the end of the day.
Yep.
Now, the idea behind pre-sales is you have a technical product or a piece of software, and you need to understand that the, the software that you have is there to solve some sort of problem or create some value for a company. Um, and the idea of pre-sales is making that connection between the clients who have requested to understand what the problem is, like what your software does, and
Yep.
you actually understanding how your software will address that problem and be able to quantify the value of that. Now, some may say, no, but I thought this was just about building demos. So demos is actually more of a tool than it is the objective. The point of the demo, in my view, and Michael, I'm happy to hear your opinion on this. The demo is really just a tool to tell the story of how they'll be able to extract value. It's not the purpose itself. And so it goes back to kind of understanding what the problem is that they're trying to solve and trying to see how the functionality, the features of your software is actually going to help them get that value.
And so I can't help it. I'm going to go off script here. And
Yeah, no,
what's
you're good.
fascinating to me is to transition from an environment like Amazon, where there's a culture around examining problem spaces, prioritizing, organizing, and investing in doing that from the inside. Now you're in a pre-sales role. And, I totally agree. It's not at all, from my perspective, about building demos. It's more around diagnosis.
Mm.
And yet you don't have those cultural norms that you had at Amazon. You've got some amount of chaos and inertia that you're up against. Uh, how have you had to adapt your approach, and what have you been able to bring over to this role from your previous one?
So I agree. It's a lot. Sales is a lot more chaotic. So I contrast the two environments, the Amazon and this could be also pre-sales, and even it applies for consulting. Is consulting and
Nice.
pre-sales are more of a pull, meaning me as a resource, I'm being pulled by the client on their needs, and I only have visibility as to what they provide me, right?
Okay.
Whereas Amazon is a lot more of a push. We understand the problems, we understand what we're trying to work on, we understand what goals we need to achieve, and we're pushing forward. So the big contrast between those things is something very simple. At Amazon, at least at the org I work with, there were no deadlines. So mind you, I had just transitioned from consulting where everything was a deadline. You had stories you had to deal with, you had demos you had to prepare, you know, everything had a deadline. And I remember the first project I was in at Amazon, I asked the PM, um, the product manager, so when is this due? And he looked at me somewhat shocked and was like, well, what do you mean? Like, when does this need to be deployed? It's like, no, there's no due date. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand it for a while. But then when I saw the process, I understood why. There's not a deadline because there needs to be it's a push system. There are other things that need to happen first. That alignment, that understanding of the problem space, that understanding, that estimation of the entitlement of what that's gonna bring before you actually get to actually deploy it. And once it's deployed, that's not the due date because there's still the process of that being monitored consistently through business reviews every week, every month, every year. And so that is kind of the mind shift between those and the others. So that's just a parenthesis back to the question of how
Yes.
do I bring some of that into what I do now? So Amazon works that way as well because they've built mechanisms in the sense of they have this writing culture. They have documents that need to be written for things to be moved to move forward. I do the same here. Um, I pre-sales role, and my colleagues realize this early as well. I'm a huge fan of writing. Before we have a meeting with the client, I've written out what I've investigated with the client and I've shared it. We all have that information now. We're not starting there and starting there like completely blank and waiting for information. We've done some work and we know what we want to ask. You start working backwards for every meeting. Every meeting has to have an agenda. Every meeting we have specific things that we need to get out of them, and that is stated up front, not just internally but also externally to the client. And so those mechanisms are kind of how I've managed to bring in some of the experience I've had in what a push system into something that's traditionally a pull system. Now you can't change the nature of the beast because at the end of the day, the client still dictates kind of the pace at which you're moving and how deals move in particular. And Michael probably knows this much better than I do. It's really dictated by the client. But at the end of the day, you can still influence it a little bit more so that that pushing part also keeps you prepared and keeps you ready because the client will always have you on your toes. But if you're prepared and you understand what the problem is from their side, um, there's really those things don't throw you out, right? You're still on your toes, but you're able to dodge and recover and understand.
Yeah, I like your push and pull analogy. It's like, you don't control the deadlines at all. If the client's gonna wants to make a decision and wants to have a meeting next Friday,
Yeah,
like you're having a meeting next Friday, and you kinda have to prepare and be ready for it with whatever you can in that time. What would you say is like to an engineer who's hesitant to join pre-sales? Sales can have a negative connotation to engineers.
yeah,
So what would you say to a young engineer who do you think should be in pre-sales, but they're scared of it?
yeah,
Or
yeah. So the engineering at the end of the day involves a lot of critical thinking and trying to make processes better and make them robust and make them trustworthy. Pre-sales is no different. Pre-sales requires a deep level of critical thinking. I would also argue that it requires something that is not often taught, but is very valuable, which is kind of how to build rapport, how to get someone to trust you. This pays off really well in your career, especially as you try to, climb the corporate ladder, let's say, because you need to build trust with people so that they can give you more scope, and then that leads eventually to a promotion and so on. But the problem is somewhat different. The problem with pre-sales is along the lines of really understanding what the problem is and doing that match with what your solution does. You can even take it a step further. You can even make it so. So this is particular to me, but I do a little more than just pre-sales. I also talk a lot with engineers and product. So being that liaison as well has a lot of value, and that is something that I think engineers will find very exciting because you can still be close to engineering and what I call the deep tech. But at the same time, you're able to interface with clients. You're able to understand their problems and see, like, at a higher level, what I call like the higher level of the tech stack of how that technology is actually going to create value. And I think so. I think BJ, we spoke about this in the prep call.
Yes.
The people that generate a lot of value are those that make those connections and create something better.
Yes.
For companies like Uber to exist, they had to have seen the demand in the market. They had to have seen certain technology that had been developing and connect the dots so that ended up creating an Uber, or in this case, you end up creating not just a larger deal, because also at the end of the day, the deal size is important when you're in pre-sales, but you're also able to deliver a solution that is a lot like more valuable than what initially the client would have thought they would have gotten.
Yeah, I like your answer because I always like to say it's like it's very intellectually challenging, like it challenges, and you kind of hit those points. The only thing I would add to it is like I also found it helps you really understand the business. Like you
Mm.
see, like the sales is where how revenue is coming into the
Yeah,
business, and so you get to see that kind of process and see what it's like to manage and work with a sales team. I think you made a great point. Like, I think if you're going to be a good pre-sales engineer, like if you build those connections to the product team, because you have to know these features, like how does this thing
yeah,
work? Because I've got to explain this. I got to be up on the spot and explain that. If you build those connections with the organization, you understand, get the product, you understand what the customers are doing, you understand how the sales team works. It's like it gives you that nice bird's eye view of the whole organization. I think it helped me in my career and thinking about like, all right, how am I going to if I start a company, how am I going to run it? I'm like, all right,
yeah.
I think I have a lot of the pieces, not all of them, but I got a good set of the pieces from that experience.
Yeah, I mean, companies survive from revenue, right? You can't, you might have the best technology and the best product in the world, but if you're unable to generate revenue, you only have limited runway with the cash that you have invested. So, 100% agree with you there.
So, Carlos, I want to probe further. When I think about within this pre-sales engineering and consultation role, you're interacting with potential buyers, and I imagine that they're both physical buyers and technical buyers on the other end. Once the purchase has been made, um, whether it's your professional services team from FICO or the client's technical organization, how do you interface with them post sales?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna add an extra one to that. We also have partners who do a lot of the
Yes, the delivery
implementations for us as
partners.
well.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously with the delivery partners, there's limited influence that you could have. But usually when these deals go through, the way I visualize this should be happening is the pre-sales role essentially transitions into a knowledge transfer for support and for the development.
Okay. Yes.
There are a lot of so when you're discussing with the client, you're understanding their organization structure, you're understanding their problem. There is a lot of valuable information that lives in your head. That valuable information will actually make the project go smoother, a whole lot smoother in terms of understanding what are the real problems, who are the people that can facilitate certain types of information. Um, in sales terminology, you also have things like you have your champion. Who's your champion? Who's your economic buyer? These things really matter. They matter in sales, but they also matter a lot in delivery. And so making sure that that knowledge is transferred is super important. It can't be just, the sale is done, that's it, I'm out. No, there has to be that knowledge transfer process. And ideally, even provide some support at the beginning to get things going because you've built rapport with the client. They trust you. And now, if, for example, you're bringing in a new company or partner, this is an outsider within that circle and that problem. So you have to make sure that that transition really goes smoothly to ensure that everyone is happy here because no one wins if this thing fails, and that's the reality of it.
I think, Carlos, I think you almost undersold it. I kind of think like a good pre-sales person, like, your written culture at Amazon, I think could translate here too. Cause if you really take the time to, I think people hear knowledge transfer, they think, all right, let's sit down for an hour and I'll just tell you some
Yeah.
things. You want to really prepare that document to say, here's the really important things. Here's the thing that like at FICO, for example, you're like, all right, at FICO, we always talk about this feature, but it happens with this customer that they don't really like that one. They like it this way. And if you have that and you put that at the very top of the document, so everyone knows that going in, so there's no misunderstanding. And then I
Yeah.
think you also said something that's important too, is that you want to feel good too that the customer is getting the value that you talked about. And part of that is transferring it to the next set of people who are going to help work on this particular problem. So I think
Yeah,
yeah,
100%.
I think you said that well.
Yeah, I think there's also something particular about me is that I'm also able to develop. And so I do I'm
Yes.
nosy as well. I'm very nosy, as you can tell. Like I try to understand people. Like I'm of the belief that anyone can teach you something. And so I actually ask a lot, and I dig a lot. And if I've already invested time in, getting this project to go and getting it to close, I'm also going to spend time trying to make sure that that is executed well. And that sometimes might translate to, you know what, guys, here's kind of an initial template, here's an initial prototype, here's what I demoed. If you need any help, let me know, etc. And we move forward. So I might be guilty of doing a bit more than what I should be. But that's
It
also
sounds
just
like it. You're
my
definitely you're definitely guilty. I can
yeah.
see.
I would imagine though that the audiences that you're trying to influence in the post sales motion are grateful for that information. Not that probably a relatively small minority that feel like their toes are being stepped on. The others are happy for the knowledge transfer.
Yeah, yeah, because it makes everyone's life easier.
Yes.
It makes because there's still a process post sale after the contract. There are renewals, and this is something that, so it's kind of equivalent to it's not finished once it's deployed. In pre-sale, well, in sales in general, and in any company, you have your goal is ARR. You
Yes.
want that contract to renew kind of as smoothly as possible and not have to go through a whole negotiation
Yes.
process. In fact, most likely you want that to be the client to push that to make sure that, hey, I don't want to lose access to this tool. Let's do the renewal.
Yes.
That's the
For
ultimate
the
goal.
for those out there that don't speak SaaS, when Carlos says ARR, that's annual recurring
So yeah,
revenue, critical metric around the
exactly.
business success of a software as a service company.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, when I was one of the best compliments I got was a professional project manager took over a project after I kind of wrote up the proposal, sent it to them, and he was going to deliver. He's a great project manager, and later he gave me this compliment. I loved it forever. He's like, "Yeah, your proposal and the documentation you wrote was great. It really helped me think through this, and I felt good. I felt like, all right, this was
Yes.
time really well spent. That it sort of helped this person make sure the client was as successful as possible."
Yeah, no, 100%.
Because I do think that we're all engaged and our audience engaged in developing and delivering relatively sophisticated solutions. And so there's been a history in IT projects of documentation as being a compliance exercise.
Mm,
And I think here the point that both of you guys are making is that it's also a reflection of your thought processes and the analytic work that you've done that sets the stage for the technical implementation of that analytic work, right?
absolutely, absolutely. And I know the podcast can't have an episode without talking about Gen AI, but I'm gonna plug it in
We
here.
we
I'm
usually
gonna
try to
plug it
keep
in
it
here.
towards the end. So yes, that was
Okay,
my
sorry.
follow-up question, Carlos. How do you see Gen AI playing with business analytics, optimization, and business roles going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm gonna first double down on the pre-sale side and what you said. The documentation was kind of thought of as compliance, but it becomes every time more and more important. So these LLMs, they're essentially trained on documentation. And if you start, within your company, let's say you have your own enterprise LLM, well, you want to have very crisp documentation about the things that you've implemented because that's what it's going to learn from. And so now we have to think about um, beyond just documentation being a compliance issue. It's more along the lines of, okay, this is going to help my Gen AI assistant help me in a better and a more efficient way, really capturing the nuances of my business. Because the real value with Gen AI eventually is really going to be getting it to understand how you work in your company, what your company's strategy is. And there's no way that it's gonna learn it if you don't write it and if you don't feed that into its
Right.
knowledge base. So yeah, that's
That's
key.
I mean, it's basically what you're saying is you're almost training the Gen AI to help you provide the right kind of context as a pre-sales implementation consultant within your firm
Exactly. And it
instead of
goes
in,
even beyond. It could
yeah.
go even
Yes.
beyond the pre-sales. It helps with the implementation as well. Again, I'm guilty of going way beyond what I'm supposed to be doing according to my job role. But the easier you can make knowledge flow throughout the organization, the more aligned everyone is going to be.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to be speaking the same language. Everyone's going to be speaking the same terminology. And the there is a cost to coordination. And if you can
Huge.
lower that cost of coordination by making sure everyone speaks the same language, everyone has the access to the same knowledge, you're generating. It's hard to measure, right? Like how much value that generates, but it definitely saves a lot of time.
Yeah, just to give you guys some perspective on that, I have a good friend who's an executive at some global software company. He has created with all of his documents and all of his presentations and all of his emails, he's created a GPT version of himself. And so his team starts with that. They interrogate and engage with that. And when they come to him with things, they've already been through his GPT indoctrinated in how best to present and communicate with him, radically lowering, he's got 100 people working for him, and radically lowering the coordination
Mm,
cost.
yeah. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think those are things that these are things I wouldn't have been exposed to if I had stayed just in a research science
Yes.
role.
Right.
Or I would have had to been really, really motivated and a lot more nosy than I currently am to be able to get to that kind of perspective. But from a pre-sale, and it's probably also due to the fact that I come from a technical background, I come from the research, I can talk to engineering, I can talk to marketing, I can talk to sales, that I'm able to kind of see these kind of where these tasks can really be detrimental in terms of being able to add value quickly to the company. So yeah.
Well, I kind of want to rephrase my last question and throw it out to both you guys as well. And that is, uh, just in a year since we started this podcast, the world has changed. The world of Gen AI has changed like crazy. And I feel like there's something of a holy war between data scientists and operations research people. On the one hand, people are used to uh, leveraging data to analytically create values and insights and predictions and guidance. And the sort of the Gen AI purists who say, well, gosh, all that specialized stuff is really subsumed by the platforms, the large language models that we have now. Uh, I think we're all on the same page disagreeing with that. But I'm interested for both of you, kind of, what do we see as the opportunities for leveraging those tools for better decision intelligence?
You want to go first, Mike,
I'll
or
go
should I?
first. I'll go first, and you can have the last word on the podcast. So, I just wrote a blog post about this, VJ. And so, the way I see it with the even the recent developments with agents and this coding stuff is that, and Carlos and I were talking about this beforehand too, is like I think that the community can build better prototypes faster. You can get up to speed faster on some of these new technologies, what they mean. And if you're curious, kind of interrogate what are the pros and cons. Like, it may be true that these pure LLMs are going to replace some of the things we do in 5 years. Like, I'm not going to forecast that. But in the meantime, I think it just opens up a whole new group of people who can do this kind of work. And I think Carlos kind of hit it on the danger of it. And it feels like the danger of it is if you don't go through this process of like figuring out what's the problem you want to solve, like you're just going to have hundreds and hundreds of solutions in an organization that don't get you anywhere, that have dependencies that you didn't think about and that kind of thing. It got a lot easier to do all of that stuff quickly and poorly But if you think through the problems, I think it sort of elevates a lot of people to do more. And if you get everyone in the right direction, I think it could be powerful. So that's my 2 cents.
100%. And let me just add a little more color to that. Gen AI has definitely lowered the barrier to authoring. Now, that's a double-edged sword as well, because now there are a lot more things that you should be reviewing and revising and monitoring. Traditionally, at least in my experience, I haven't seen great monitoring and revision, consistent cadence revision, being done in a lot of these projects. It has to be ingrained into company's culture. But other than that, a lot of times we just, deploy, that's it, I'm done. So it definitely has a lot of danger to it. Whether they can replace us in terms of doing our function of authoring, well, maybe for some things it will, like Michael said. But I think our value isn't just in authoring; it's actually in understanding the problem and connecting it to the business value. And I think something we should be doing more now, and now with GenAI, it's going to be more important that we learn it, is to be better at monitoring, reviewing, and checking, confirming. Because now we have this tool that can do infinite, like 100 times more output than we can.
Right.
So we have a lot more things to review, but we're going to have to figure out ways to streamline reviewing and checking that these things are actually doing what they're supposed to do.
Well,
Yeah, I
VJ,
would
what's your
add-
answer to that question? Yeah, why
So-
don't you give us
So let
yours?
me add kind of layer on top of that that this notion of monitoring is not only through the development or authorship process, but also post implementation. Because we, at the same time that our tools are getting more and more powerful, we're also seeing change come at a more rapid pace. And one of our early guests talked about that in some detail and has documented that. And so the ability and the accountability for what is this process doing and taking action when it's not doing what it should be doing or when it's deviating from what the expectations were or what's acceptable. Those are the jobs of the future. I liken it to we're taking people off the assembly line and some of them are monitoring digital processes now, right? And so we're going to have less resource invested in authorship in all kinds of different things, but more in what Jeremy Utley calls stewardship around, hey, did we build it the right way? And now that we've deployed it, is it performing as we expected? And if not, what's the fix? What's the response? And managing that as a process. My friend Sam Eldersfeld, while he was at Amazon, he sort of came up with a set of principles around agile for data science and optimization projects. And that is, I think, closer to where we're going, where I feel like now we're taking what had historically been discrete time stuff and deploying it for continuous time monitoring. And the tools to do that and the mindset around that are very scientific, right, by nature, even though we're not asking those scientists to do nearly as much authoring.
Yeah.
So those are my thoughts.
No,
Perfect.
I 100% agree. The problem now becomes, how do I ensure that it's meeting the quality of the
Yes.
outcomes that I want to achieve? And that goes back to the entire problem-driven framework, understanding decision intelligence. It's all about outcomes, and also looking at the end game, right? And having a clear opinion, a clear perspective on what it is that you consider as a success. What are the outcomes you're trying to drive for? And then so now the engineering comes into part of, okay, how do I ensure that whatever this thing is producing meets quality? There's the initial engineering task there. And there I would argue also, to be able to do that effectively, you also have to author. So it's a kind of a chicken and egg thing. To ensure that the output that it's generating is correct, you also have to have experience authoring as well. So there's going to be an interesting situation in a few years if there aren't enough junior people that have had that experience to actually be able to confirm the direct output is doing what it's supposed to, which is correct.
Right.
And then there's the other part. Once it's deployed, is that new artifact actually giving the results or the outcomes that I wanted it to drive? And then that's another engineering problem that is at a larger scale now, just because those LLMs are producing many of them at the same time. So
Yes.
there's going to be more work for us.
That's fine.
The career is not going away. Just the way we think about it and the tools we use are going to be different.
Well, that's a perfect thought to wrap up on. Carlos, why don't you tell the listeners where they can get more information about you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. Just look for me as Carlos Zetina. If you're interested about these things, I would definitely recommend looking at Zohar Strenka's Meta Problem, the Decision Intelligence framework by Dr. Lorianne Pratt. Definitely the Informed Analytics framework. I think this is a great. This is the first attempt, I think, of officially um, systematizing what I call tribal knowledge, because you kind of learn this on the fly. You get hurt a few times when you're doing this and learning it on the fly. But so now there's a framework that really helps you adjust that. And then when you're thinking about like you're down to the modeling part and how to capture the different elements of an analytics artifact that need to be accounted for, definitely take a look at Warren Powell's framework and chapter one of his little book. It is very interesting because it applies to a very generic way of
Right.
understanding what components you need to account for in your model.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks for your time today, Carlos.
Oh, thank
Okay.
you for the invite. It was great talking. Loved the discussion, and looking forward to the next episode. Thanks.